Story 1. I was called to a house where a woman claimed her printer was possessed, printing strange messages at 3 a.m. when no one was around. She even had grainy footage of it lighting up in the dark. It turned out her teenage son was pranking her remotely from his father's house. I disabled the remote access, fixed the settings, and now she calls me the IT exorcist. Story 2. Used to deliver appliances. On the first day at the first house, in an upscale neighborhood, the woman opened the door and a wall of odor hit us. The smell of cat urine, cigarette smoke, and other unpleasant odors filled the air. The walls were dirty, roaches were scattered all over the counters, and there was waste everywhere. It was truly awful. We brought in a new refrigerator, and I had to excuse myself to get fresh air several times. 20 minutes later, we got back into the delivery truck. I looked over at the driver, who had been doing this for a while, waiting for him to say something. He looked at me and asked if this was my first delivery. I said yes. He responded, "Well, that's probably the worst house I've ever been in, so there's nowhere to go but up." We actually drove back to the warehouse to get clean shirts because ours smelled terrible. Story 3. I walked into a house as a technician once and was offered banana bread by a parrot before the owner even said hello. I am still not sure who was in charge. Story 4. Adult Protective Services. 1. A couple pulled out knives on each other while drunk. There was a cockroach infestation. I helped a woman remove a cockroach from her oxygen tube using a knitting needle. 3 weeks after open-heart surgery, a woman refused follow-up care. I found her lying in bed with her chest wound open by about 2 inches at the widest, filled with maggots. She was still alive, coherent, and telling me to go away. There were too many hoarders to count, but the worst was a cat hoarder whose carpet squished and bubbled with cat urine with every step. There were approximately 80 to 90 cats. I fell through the dog feces-covered and rotted floors of someone's family room and landed a relatively short distance in the hoard in the basement. The fire department had to come and get me out. I removed a severely autistic young man from his neglectful parents' home. The father threw a toilet at me and was arrested on the spot. To clarify the toilet situation, the autistic man's primary behavior was property destruction. At some point, he ripped all the toilets out of the house, so the toilet the father threw at me was not connected. It was just there. Refusing to replace the toilets and get actual help for their son was one of the major contributing factors to why we obtained a court order to remove him. They also didn't replace any windows, and the walls were basically in disrepair. The young man was not dressed, and he was also engaging in inappropriate behavior in his bedroom. He was doing really well when I closed the case a few months later. Story 5. I once found an old missile that was unarmed, but we didn't know that, so we had to call the bomb squad. I also found an abandoned lizard that I had to rehome. Story 6. I once took a job from Craigslist to help a man move a refrigerator. He forgot to mention he was a massive hoarder, and the winding path through all the items was at most a foot wide. The smell was unbearable, like what I imagined dead feet and cabbage might smell like. It hit you right in the face. I made him pay me double, and then we got to work moving things from one pile to another. God forbid he throw anything out. There were 50-piece puzzles he had done with his grandmother, who died in the early 1990s. A stack of them. It was pure hell getting that refrigerator out the door. Story 7. I used to perform cable installations, and once a client had a full jungle in their living room with vines, heat lamps, and a parrot that wouldn't stop screaming, "Leave." The entire time, I was setting up the Wi-Fi as if it were just a regular Tuesday. Story 8. My husband was a cable technician who installed cable modems. The strangest person he ever encountered was a man dressed in a Peter Pan costume, sitting on top of chair backs with his feet on the chair seats. He spoke in a very high-pitched voice, and there were unusual items scattered everywhere. Apparently, he needed his cable modem replaced for his online activities. That was around 20 years ago. Story 9. We were informed that we would be required to report any drugs seen in homes. We conveyed that we could not identify drugs unless they were in a prescription bottle. They abandoned the idea. Story 10. Home health nurse here. Most people are not clean. It's very rare that I enter a clean home, and my standards have lowered after doing this long enough. I've stepped in dog feces in a home and had to step on puppy pads soaked in pet urine to provide care. I live in an extremely hot climate, and the number of people who don't have air conditioning or can't afford to turn it on is alarming. These living conditions are very sad, and the working conditions can be harsh. I've had patients become flirtatious with me, considering the types of care I provide, such as catheter changes, wound care, and ostomy care. This is quite unfortunate and uncomfortable. Mental illness is a part of this. One patient needed wound care on multiple areas, and her small dogs were constantly licking her. The patient wasn't very mobile, and the dog started licking a wound further away from the one I was treating. The patient didn't mind and even thought it was cute, which was very disturbing. I attempted to educate her and prevent the dog from doing so. She kept using we when speaking to me, indicating she meant herself and her dogs. There was a roach infestation. They were crawling all over the patient and everywhere in the main living area. One recent situation involved a patient with changes in mental status due to alcoholism. While making small talk during care, she couldn't recall how many children she had or if she had grandchildren. It was heartbreaking. That being said, the vast majority of my patients are kind and welcoming. However, the environment can be challenging because I have no control over it, and the areas I am sent to can be very dangerous. Story 11. 2 different types of experiences. After leaving the military as a medic, I worked as a civilian medic on ambulances for a few years in southwest Missouri, including Branson and Taney County, as well as nearby counties. This job had us going into all sorts of places across the socioeconomic spectrum. As you can imagine, we generally spent more time responding to lower-income individuals as they tended to have more health problems. We encountered severe poverty, methamphetamine houses, and various distressing situations. The conditions we dealt with were sometimes beyond comprehension. There were places filled with garbage, including rotting food, human and pet feces, and overall disarray. It was a challenge to ensure our own safety while trying to assist people in need. Firefighters and police were often on the scene to help, and the firefighters were almost always the most supportive. They would assist us in accessing locations and provide help in getting individuals out, as many patients were morbidly obese. Later, I attended law school, and early in my career, I practiced criminal defense in Philadelphia and the surrounding counties, including Delaware and Montgomery. Similar to the health issues mentioned earlier, individuals with criminal legal problems also tend to be on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. When some clients could not come to our offices, we would conduct home visits for client intake and pre-hearing preparation. The worst conditions I remember were in West Philadelphia and Chester City. We often visited places that were literally falling apart, with front doors barely attached and bullet holes in the walls. Most people have never witnessed extreme poverty firsthand. You can see it in pictures and possibly on television, but that is no substitute for experiencing it in person. It is a multisensory experience, invoking sights, sounds, and especially smells. Walking into a place where someone has died and remained there for several days or weeks is an experience I will never forget. Story 12. I walked into a house to fix their Wi-Fi. Grandma was in the living room, dressed in full makeup and placed in a glass coffin. They said she liked to be around family. I fixed the router in record time. Story 13. I am working on the computer in a woman's house, in her husband's home office. She is wearing a robe that is not fully closed. While I work, she is going through her husband's drawers, taking out toys and waving them around, yelling, "He isn't using these on me. That's all I know for sure." Story 14. I was a residential cleaner. I worked in a home divided into 4 floors. The top floor had 3 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, a den, and a corridor for the family. The middle floor featured a kitchen, dining area, and living room. The third floor contained 2 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, a kitchenette, a dining area, and a den for assisted living. The fourth and bottom floor included a laundry room and 2 additional bedrooms. The group home owner's vacuum was broken, and they had all hard floors. I swept and mopped every room and corridor weekly. Their young child threw yogurt on the floor and insisted that I clean it up. I refused because I had just mopped, and her mother cleaned it up without addressing the child. I was called slave by that child for months, but she was disabled and just a kid, though it was annoying. The men in the group home were not skilled in housework. The fruit fly problem was overwhelming. One week, I had an extra half hour and decided to set up fly traps, and they all disappeared. They neglected their dog's dishes and bed. Each week, I took it upon myself to clean the dog's dishes, vacuum his bed, and spend time with him for company. They weren't mean, just the type to overlook things. When I created a list for the next cleaner, I included dog care on it. The father was a media artist doing sound work. I found it strange to have overstimulated autistic children and operate chainsaws and hammer in your office. I quit because I became tired of the husband screaming at the kids. I have trauma related to that, and it wasn't sustainable for me to work in a house that felt unsafe. Additionally, one of the men in the group home had a habit of watching me through a crack in his door inappropriately. It was a difficult work situation, and I wasn't compensated enough for it. I'm glad to be out. Story 15. Oh my God. I have a story from my husband. He used to work in solar energy on the East Coast and often had to enter many basements for the main panel. One time, he went into a basement filled with Santa Clauses everywhere. Life-size, massive ones, and some were even the size of his finger, literally covering the entire basement from floor to ceiling. He sent me a video, and it was incredible. Story 16. Used to install home security systems. I have two that I always remember. The first encounter was with a homeowner whose house was full of microwave ovens and VCRs that were in various states of disassembly but were all still plugged in. He was a peculiar person. In the second instance, we arrived and spoke with the homeowner. He walked us around, showing us the doors and windows he wanted secured. While in the living room, I noticed a large metal tray on the coffee table. It contained a significant amount of cannabis and some rolling papers. My partner and I noticed it but didn't say anything because it was their home. After completing the walkthrough and gathering our gear, I stood in the entryway just off the living room when I heard the homeowner exclaim, "Oh no!" I heard some clanking sounds, and when I returned, the tray was gone. We all acted as if it had never been there, but I still laugh when I think of it. Story 17. I went into a kitchen for a customer to take measurements for new cabinets, and there were roaches everywhere. I got naked in my backyard before going inside my house and used the garden hose to rinse off because I was afraid those pests were in my clothes. I fumigated my car out of fear they were inside. It looked like a black, shiny ocean of roaches on every surface in that kitchen. I shudder when I think about it. Then there was the dollhouse. Dolls everywhere. This lady had only one open space at her dining room table, an empty chair. I asked where that doll was. The lady said she got up one day and left, keeping that chair empty for when she returned. I decided to leave that job. Story 18. One time I was shadowing for a class. The person I was working with said to watch out for the dogs inside. Once inside, I saw 3 dogs, and the owner's children took care of them and let them out. However, I kept hearing barking from inside. The family had a bird that could mimic sounds and would bark. Story 19. I am a kitchen designer and I spend a lot of time in people's homes. I have had more experiences with gun shooting from a back porch while drinking a beer than I would like to admit. These situations usually lead to successful sales because the husband appreciates my work and the wife feels comfortable as a result. I have also been solicited for inappropriate propositions on more than one occasion, but I prefer not to comment on that. Additionally, I have been offered drugs and marijuana more times than I can count. I have encountered some homes that were so dirty I needed to go home to change and shower. One particular experience was in a hoarder's home that looked like they had fried meals daily for 30 years without ever cleaning. One client wanted to remodel her kitchen. Her previous kitchen was about 30 years old. She asked me to call all my suppliers and search for items from their dusty rafters. Every cabinet was a different style, color, and finish. The hardware was a random assortment from what vendors had on hand. Each piece of granite came from whatever scraps the stone yards had available. As the kitchen designer, I was able to persuade her to let me create a cohesive look by patterning and selecting from the available cabinets, hardware, and countertops. It was a really enjoyable project, but her entire house had a similar disorganized style. Story 20. I was setting up Wi-Fi for a very wealthy client. In his home office, he had a life-size nude photo of his wife. He also had security cameras installed in every room of the house, including the one used by his teenage daughter. Automatic security shutters were present on every door and window. Story 21. I have been a handyman, carpenter, and property inspector on and off for years. A few things that stand out. I have worked in cities with a vibrant entertainment industry, and sometimes I would get hired by celebrities or their assistants. Once I passed the vibe check, they would ask me to do a lot of tasks. I would inform them that there were certain things I hadn't done before or didn't have the credentials for, and they would respond, "Can you learn and do a halfway decent job?" They only wanted people they trusted working in their homes, not caring how long things took or whether I was appropriately qualified within reason. Building on that, I helped multiple wives of various rock stars leave or divorce their husbands. I often assisted the estranged wives, which is common, not just for rock stars, with moving furniture or setting up new places, including televisions, curtains, and security systems. They would vent to me a lot. I have a background in therapy and trauma, and I would listen while performing repetitive tasks, relaying what my therapists had advised me. I also have an imposing appearance, so when an ex-partner or spouse showed up unexpectedly, I would start working in sight, which usually encouraged them to behave or leave. I'm also a musician with over 20 years of experience, and this is my side gig, so it felt conflicting when I encountered someone whose music I admired but had to remain stoic. There were times when I was approached romantically. Many of my clients were single or divorced women, and I am a big, liberal guy who fixes things and listens. I only engaged when it was clear we were both single and of sound mind. Most of the time, I was already in a relationship or sensed that a romantic connection would complicate matters. Playful flirting was acceptable, and they often tipped me generously. It wasn't just women who shared their stories with me. I would also get hired by men who were lonely and would stand around chatting while I worked. Initially, I disliked being watched because I thought they were critiquing my work. However, I began to realize that watching me work was a benign and soothing activity, similar to watching a campfire. They would talk about their families and businesses, and I would relay insights from my therapists as platitudes. I would say, you can fix this pretty easily in about 5 minutes. I'll guide you through it. But they often couldn't tell their wives or families they were helping the handyman. They would also tip me well. I had to check properties for banks, a job I disliked. Part of this role involved gaining entry to homes, noting their condition, and ensuring they were unoccupied. I encountered squatters a few times who became aggressive, but I only had to brandish a firearm once. Most of the time, I informed them that I wasn't kicking them out, but I needed to file a report. I would say, "I can wait about 3 days to turn this in." After that, it could take anywhere from 1 to 6 weeks for them to send law enforcement to serve an eviction notice, followed by another 30 days or so for them to enforce it. Can you make alternate plans by then? Once, I was in a remote area of Oklahoma and needed to gain entry to what turned out to be a chicken farm. The locks had all been changed, so I had to pry open a window and crawl through. As soon as I entered, I was hit by a foul odor. I looked around and saw bags of groceries on the counter that had been left full of produce and meat. There were open sacks of corn scattered throughout the house and an overwhelming number of mice. I checked the upstairs, which appeared to have housed 20 or more people, with mattresses on the floor, condom wrappers, children's clothes, and old food containers. Then I went downstairs to check the other bedrooms. Upon entering the primary bedroom, I found it stacked floor to ceiling with prescription drugs. After reading a couple of boxes, I deduced that I had stumbled upon a significant stash of opioids. I considered the street value briefly, but decided it was better to leave the situation alone. I never got closure on that encounter and still wonder what was actually taking place there. Story 22. I visited a customer's home to set up a fairly expensive mesh network system. I found it odd that they wanted a home network setup costing over £500 when they lived in a small terraced house in a rough part of the city. Upon arrival, I was immediately hit by a foul smell as they let me in. They offered me a drink, which I declined, trying to avoid inhaling too deeply. Animal droppings were scattered across the scuffed and faded tiles in the hallway. As I stepped around them, I considered leaving, but I entered the living room, which was humid and noisy with machines putting steam into the air. I looked at the unsafe-looking sockets where the customer wanted the mesh installed. The room was dank, moldy, and dark, with sheets covering the bay window. Objects, likely furniture, were obscured by old, dirty sheets, presumably to protect them from dampness. What surprised me was that the droppings were clearly not from dogs or cats. I had grown up with both types of animals, and this was something different. I started the installation, and the woman who let me in began talking to me. I was distracted by a scrabbling sound from above, which prompted me to keep looking at the moldy corners of the room to ensure nothing would fall. The woman spoke about her rescues, and I tried to be polite while minimizing my oxygen intake and hurrying through the job. She then removed one of the sheets covering an unknown object, a cage containing some small rodents that I couldn't quite identify. They resembled desert mice. I smiled to placate her, and she seemed encouraged, throwing off another sheet from a different cage, which appeared to have no visible animal inside. She then rushed out of the room and up the stairs. I could hear her footsteps and her talking directly above me, where the scrabbling sound had been intermittent. Suddenly, I heard her cackling unsettlingly as she came back down the stairs. I turned to see why she was laughing, and a blur of black and white shot into the room, flinging itself around the cages, jumping from object to object, and soaring across the furniture. It climbed up the curtains and onto the curtain rod, and for the first time, I saw what it was. A massive capuchin monkey, much larger than any I'd seen at the zoo. It was howling, screeching, and chattering, baring its teeth and almost hissing. It did not seem happy. It struck me as a mixture of aggression and distress. At that moment, I thought, nope, I'm out, and walked past the cackling woman and out the front door to my van. Back at the office, I learned that the customer had called asking whether I was returning to finish the job. I mentioned that another engineer was welcome to, but I certainly wouldn't be, emphasizing that a risk assessment needed to be done, as it was unsafe. We ended up contacting the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. I'm not sure if it was just an internal rumor, since a director handled the situation, but in the following days, the chatter in the office indicated that over 20 different types of exotic, illegal animals had been found in that cramped, damp, squalid house. To this day, I can vividly remember the smell and the awful warmth it emanated. Story 23. I rode along in an ambulance during pre-med college, serving both inner-city and suburban areas. I was constantly astounded by the conditions in which people live. I don't mean minor messes where someone didn't anticipate guests with a bit of laundry and dirty dishes. I am talking about hoarder scenarios with items clearly neglected for years. I had to stay focused on helping those in need, but getting them out of the house and into the ambulance was often a challenge. Story 24. I was a case manager for individuals with significant mental health challenges, including schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and borderline personality disorder. I visited a woman's home who had known me for a year. She thought I was an intruder and pulled out her gun. I ran and she repeatedly called my phone, threatening to come and harm us at our home. I quit shortly after that. Story 25. I once worked at a disaster cleanup business after fires, floods, and other disasters. We removed belongings for cleaning and decontamination and then returned them after homes were repaired. We witnessed everything. We saw the difficult financial situations when going through paperwork and collection notices. We saw the skid marks on underwear. We discovered personal collections, including explicit content, and I cannot count how many personal items were found in closets during packing. We noticed stashes of pills and other substances. We documented everything: jewelry, firearms, coins, everything. It was astonishing to see the innermost lives of people. Story 26. I feel so lucky. My interesting stories are all about cute pets that, with the owner's permission, get a photo on the job site photos app we use. My favorite was the man who had a white cat that he adored. Later, he called us for another job and mentioned he had added a little dog to his household. During the first visit, the cat was all in my lap and climbing on the paperwork. During the second visit, the puppy was following me around outside. Story 27. I am a landscaper. I was doing a job in a wealthy retirement community for a woman who was difficult, somewhat strange, but overall pretty nice to me. There was nowhere for me to discreetly relieve myself, so the homeowner offered for me to use her bathroom. I took off my shoes and dusted myself off as she led me inside. She pointed to the bathroom and told me to go ahead. I opened the door to find her husband in there with his pants down. I quickly slammed the door shut and informed her that I had walked in on her husband. She directed me to another bathroom, where I quickly relieved myself and felt uncomfortable. While I was in there, I heard her husband come out and ask why she would let me into that bathroom, knowing he was in there, to which she replied, "Oh, it's fine. She has seen plenty of that." So she seemed to have set me up just for fun, and also implied that I had seen a lot of men's anatomy. Story 28. Years ago, I did door-to-door sales for an energy company for a short time to pay for school. One particularly dreary evening, I was exhausted after a long day at school. It was hailing, and I was only halfway through my list of addresses. I was about to quit on the spot and just go home. I decided to do one more stop, which happened to be a dorm, so they didn't have anything to say about the power since the landlord handles all that. However, they saw me suffering in the cold and invited me in for dinner. I was served tortillas, first with hot coffee and later with a beer, and then they sent me back on my way. I offered to pay for the excellent service, but they refused. It was the nicest thing some total strangers have ever done for me. Story 29. I was a maid. People do not secure their guns. One time, while I was dusting, a loaded gun fell off a shelf onto the floor. We had to call the office, which contacted the client, who told us to leave it on the floor for them to put away later. Guns were under beds and everywhere. Story 30. I worked on a series in Lawton, Oklahoma, where we visited the trailer home of a woman who weighed almost 700 pounds. It was 114 degrees that day. Her son and his nurse girlfriend lived there with 3 children in a home that was infested, sticky, smelly, and overall hazardous. There were used needles scattered in the yard where the children played. The son used his mother's mobility scooter to go on runs to Sonic Burger. Story 31. I did apartment maintenance for a year and only had one memorable experience. In this apartment, a woman lived there with her 3 children, 1 toddler and 2 school-aged kids. I never saw the children since they were always gone when I was working there. There were dirty diapers on the counters in the bathroom, and I didn't even want to know what the stains on the carpet were. The apartment itself was filthy, with trash and rotting food everywhere and piles of hoarded items. The part that made me furious, though, was that she had a nice king-sized bed and lots of clothes in her room, which she was always in when I did work there, lounging on her bed while ignoring her toddler, who was always on an iPad. Her 2 older children had thin, disgusting mattresses on the dirty floor in their room, with no sheets, just a blanket and pillow, and absolutely no other furniture. I felt so bad for those poor kids and wished I could have done something. I suggested to my manager that we call Child Protective Services, but apparently, they had already been there a couple of times and did nothing. Now, to leave on a good note, I was escorting an air conditioning repair technician once, and they had a kitten in their apartment. The resident was gone at the time. That little kitten was so adorable and playful, and I had my hands full trying to keep it from crawling into the air conditioning unit while the technician had it out of the wall. I saw a bouquet of lilies where the kitten could chew on them, so I placed them on top of the refrigerator and left a note letting the resident know they are poisonous to cats. When I went back in later to fix something else, the resident thanked me, and we started talking about her very recent divorce. I often get told the weirdest things right off the bat. I shared how I had fairly recently left my husband and how, while it was incredibly difficult at the time, I was much happier and had less stress. Once they got over the initial difficulties, my children were doing better too. She ended up crying and thanking me for giving her hope. I miss that job sometimes. Story 32. I used to work for a government office responsible for visiting people's homes to survey the number of residents and the conditions they lived in, so they could receive scores for social benefits, similar to a population census. One day, it became clear that they were hiding items that would increase their score, such as an air conditioning unit. A man in his 60s began to get nervous and seemingly decided to start farting, saying he needed to go to the bathroom and urgently rushing us out of his living room. When we returned the next day, he refused to open the door, citing stomach issues and concerns for our safety. Then he let out the loudest fart I have ever heard to prove his point. I respect his dedication. Story 33. Almost 20 years ago, I made a few home visits during my rotation at a center for the aging. Luckily, there were no horror stories. However, one home was filled with 3,000 dolls. The house was small, and I will never forget looking up and feeling surrounded by a cave of dolls. They were stacked along every wall to the ceiling. The husband and wife were in their 90s and were very kind. A social worker asked the wife what she planned to do with all the dolls, and she sweetly replied that she wanted to give them to her children and grandchildren, but her daughter was begging to help her get rid of them. I can only imagine that daughter going in there after their deaths to clean the house. Story 34. I do remodels. My most recent one was both frustrating and impressive. This project involved installing 42-inch tall beadboard wainscoting in an older bathroom. The bathroom is small and serves 2 professional adults and their 2 daughters in their early 20s. I knew it would be upstairs, tight, and busy. In most bathroom remodels, I also account for time spent cleaning up and moving personal belongings out of the way. Most people are reluctant to show how messy their spaces are and do not want their bathroom items sorted through. When there are a lot of personal belongings, I typically place them in the tub. In this case, I filled the tub completely with the clutter that had accumulated. This is an 8x9 bathroom. Some of the items included 3 bathroom scales, 3 medical sharps containers, complete with needles, a full-size bathrobe wrapped in packaging buried under piles of used sanitary items, at least 6 old towels covered in mold and mildew, and the list goes on. When I arrived to measure, I thought, okay, they have some items packed around the toilet and vanity because it's small and there isn't much room. I had no idea how densely it was packed or how unpleasant it would be. This situation reflected a serious commitment to neglecting cleanliness and organization. Story 35. I work in real estate and have seen some interesting things. A family had raccoons living in a spare bedroom, and there were plenty of sex toys on the nightstands and a swing in the bedroom. The funniest moment was when I walked in to show a house, always announcing that I was there in case anyone was home. We looked around and walked into the master bedroom, where the owner was watching TV in his underwear. He was a hefty guy, and there were mirrors on the ceiling. Needless to say, we left, and they weren't interested. Story 36. I'm a plumber, and I can talk for hours about the things I've seen in people's houses. Items like fleshlights, dildos, and butt plugs lined up for display, not to mention full-size sex dolls just hanging out in a man's living room. I've walked on a path cleared of garbage that went from the man's refrigerator to his TV to his toilet. I've seen drug paraphernalia, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. These individuals didn't bother to clean, hide, or be subtle in any way. They really didn't care. And it happens more often than you might think. Story 37. My wife was a residential real estate appraiser. She would do all the appraisals for a finance professional who would take any deal if the rate was high enough. I accompanied her a few times to jobs in parts of a neighboring city where she felt unsafe alone. At one house, an elderly man was doing a refinance. The house was divided into multiple small bedrooms, except for a larger front room with a poker table. When she asked if the house was used as a business, he replied, "Yes, ma'am. I have ladies in the back and a poker game up front." When my wife referred to him as Mr. Last Name, the elderly man said, "Oh, everybody just calls me Slasher." Story 38. I'm a decorator and have seen some of the nicest houses. 9-bedroom, beautifully furnished homes. I've also encountered real poverty. 1-bedroom bungalows with walls covered in dubious stains and carpets that smell of pets. Then there are the truly peculiar situations. A full box of shortbread left on the ground and a newspaper filled with curses under every picture, wishing for them to suffer. People redecorate after a child moves out or after losing a loved one. Some may not have the energy to wallpaper, while others may be unable to lift their arms due to serious injuries. And the items I've been given: a packet of chocolate biscuits because the freezer broke, for dining room chairs, a replica of the Magna Carta, and 400-pound worth of fabric offcuts, along with a bag of shirts. One of the more poignant moments was arriving at work and being informed that the lady's husband had passed away 2 weeks prior. Her daughter refused to help her with his ashes and urn, prompting me to embark on a little side quest at the end of the day. Story 39. Thank you for unlocking my trauma regarding my experience working in hospice care for a few years. I had never spent much time in elderly people's homes until then, and it was fascinating. Suffice it to say, I came away with some lifelong rules for myself. 1. I never watch television unless I am in bed in my pajamas. I cared for people who had multiple televisions in their homes, often 1 or 2 in each room, all tuned into the same news channel 24 hours a day. They would lie there, constantly frustrated by the state of the world. I vowed then and there not to be a spectator of life, and 15 years later, I've upheld that commitment. Humans tend to become hoarders as we age. Resist this tendency. When you grow older in a large home, it becomes difficult to maintain. You might find yourself surrounded by items you haven't used in over a decade, collecting dust because you can't see well enough to clean or too reluctant to hire someone to help. It made me embrace minimalism. Story 40. I worked in applied behavior analysis and was working with a client. He was being rowdy, and I was implementing the behavior plan. I heard talking and laughing, so I turned around to see the whole family staring and laughing at me. The real kicker was that the grandfather was completely naked. The family didn't care that he was naked in front of me. They just laughed more when they realized I was uncomfortable with it. It was a strange family, and I requested to be removed from the client's case. Story 41. Field adjuster for property insurance. I have encountered many unusual situations. There was an elderly couple who had an adult entertainment area in their basement, including shelves full of DVDs they had made of themselves. Listing the damaged contents in that area was interesting. They were very nice people. I have been in my fair share of hoarder houses, including some where individuals have died. Some houses were filled with dead animals. It was very sad. There was a man who overdosed on drugs while running a bath. The hot water overflowed and caused significant issues with body decay. The contractor said it was the worst he had ever seen, and I would have to agree. We had to strip it down to the studs. An elderly man and his adult son, who had mental health issues, had their house explode. After we boarded it up, squatters broke in. I did not know until my inspection. They threw the client's belongings all over the place, including his extensive adult film collection. I have seen disgusting houses filled with cigarette smoke. One house had a floor that rotted to the point where the client fell through it. When I attended, I thought the walls were painted orange. They were not. They were white, but it was just cigarette residue on all the walls. Story 42. I used to work for a carpet cleaning company. On my first day, the owner told me to never touch or flirt with a customer. During my first week, I cleaned a carpet that had a gray dusty stain on it. The lady living there was in the room wearing lingerie and flirting. I learned later that the gray stain on the carpet was her late husband's ashes. It was awkward. Story 43. I visited people's homes to interview them for acceptance into a training program for individuals with disabilities. 3 experiences stand out the most. First, in one home, there were multiple dogs all wearing heavy chains and padlocks. This is often used to build up muscles for dog fighting. I called the authorities when I left but am unsure of the outcome. Second, the furniture in another home was made entirely from pallets. Chairs, a bed, and tables were all constructed from pallets with either some cloth, cushions, or plywood on top. Third, I visited a lady's home where all of her possessions were stored in clear plastic bins stacked on top of each other. When I asked her if she was planning to move or if she had just moved in, she told me no. She had been there for 3 years and did not feel the need to take things out unless she needed them, at which point she would return them to the bins. Story 44. In the late 1980s, there was a collection of adult videos in a setting of absolute squalor and hoarding with no running water. The kitchen was unrecognized until a 10-year-old pointed out, "This is the kitchen." No parents were home, and there were 3 children under the age of 12. Story 45. In my experience, people can be quite unpleasant. I used to collect cars for an auction company at the end of the owner's lease period. They were aware of my arrival, and everything was generally amicable, with the obvious exception of the occasional repossession I conducted. They also knew in advance that I would perform a condition and safety check at the home before driving off. The number of times I arrived at a car filled to the roof with hoarded items is sadly too many to count. I encountered dirty diapers on the back seat, full of mold, indicating they had been there for a long time. I even had an Audi that reeked of cannabis, which I refused to take. It was rare for me to find a well-maintained vehicle. When I did, I would overlook a lot of the damage. I followed a set process to document damage, which included taking over 50 separate images, plus more if there was additional damage to record, and a detailed video. I then had to explain the damage to the customer and provide a breakdown of what their finance company would charge them. I got to see the inside of many houses, ranging from inexpensive rentals to multimillion-pound mansions. The vast majority were as bad as the cars. The way some people can live like that both baffles and horrifies me. Story 46. My son was a mover. He often expressed frustration about parents who would leave their children unattended with the movers. They would drive to the other side of town to the new place and leave the kids at home while the movers were trying to do their job. Story 47. A technician at my job visited an elderly person's home and was locked in the laundry room because he needed to order more parts and return another day. They wanted him to fix the washer immediately without the necessary parts. My manager had to negotiate to get the technician released, or we would have called the police. Story 48. Roaches crawled on a woman's thighs and arms, and she didn't even flick them off. A man wearing a red satin thong and robe told me he was ready for me. I got out on the wrong floor in a seedy apartment building. Every door was open, and a scantily dressed woman was outside each one. I opened someone's kitchen cupboard, finding only a bottle of whiskey and a box of cereal. A man interrupted the visit to sell drugs to a visitor in front of me. The carpet was undulating due to a massive bedbug infestation. A woman complained she couldn't walk because her toenails were about an inch long. Story 49. Family business. Carpet cleaners. My dad and I arrive at a couple's home. The small, maybe 1,000 square feet, give or take. They have a toddler and a newborn we can hear making noise in the back room. There are plastic bags lined up around the perimeter of the living room, down the hall, and along the walls of one of the bedrooms. There's a dark gray stain on the carpet about 3 to 4 feet from the walls. We start to measure the carpeted areas to provide a quote for the cost. My dad moves one of the bags to access the wall for an accurate measurement. The bag splits open, revealing that it contains used diapers. All of the bags against the wall are filled with used diapers, and we notice the stains on the floor. Dad tells me to pack up. He informs the couple that we are not proceeding with the job and that we are leaving. 2 minutes later, we depart. I'm not sure if he called Child Protective Services, but he should have. Story 50. I worked in a municipal water department and had to check on a water meter in the basement of a home daycare. With the property owner's permission and an appointment, they used the entire basement as a litter box, dumping bags on the floor and allowing the cats to go everywhere. The smell was overwhelming. The worst part was that she had her laundry down there, with dirty clothing scattered on the floor alongside the used cat litter. We promptly reported the issue to the state daycare licensing authority. Story 51. I used to work in home health, and here are some of my favorites. A very polite-looking 96 and 92-year-old couple with a fully equipped sex dungeon, which they were still regularly using. The man had a hip replacement, and our poor physiotherapist had to give him safe movement advice. A blind Persian lady with a 13-foot python, which she talked to constantly in her native language. Her house had no lights. She didn't use them anyway, so she didn't want to pay the bill. She and the snake were absolutely lovely, but definitely a bit spooky when you first entered. 4 life-size Daleks that the client built himself. You could sit inside them and they had wheels and pedals to move around, as well as various sound effects and flashing lights. I would quite often turn up and find him chilling in one of them. People are amazing, though sometimes they can be quite gross. Story 52. I drove an ambulance as a young man. Many wild stories come to mind, but one that has stuck with me occurred when I went to the home of a well-known lawyer, supposedly to take his mother for hospice care. When I arrived at the mansion, the lawyer was not present, but his wife was there. She instructed me to enter the mother's room, which was locked. The wife obtained the key and unlocked the door. It turned out they had the mother lying on a bare mattress on the floor, with 2 space heaters blasting, making the room stifling hot. Her lips were cracked, and she was delirious. I went outside and reported the situation to law enforcement. We removed the woman from the home, and about 5 minutes later, on the way to the hospital, she began responding and recognizing her surroundings. After the ordeal, the lawyer threatened to sue me, made a scene, and tried to get me fired, but he ended up facing charges. Ultimately, he paid some court fines and avoided jail time because his mother passed away in the hospital, and it seemed he was too wealthy or influential to face consequences. Story 53. In a small house from the late 1890s to early 1900s, there was one electrical outlet for the entire house, located in the kitchen. I stopped counting after 5 extension cords connected together. Story 54. Sorting through papers for a client in preparation for a debt counseling appointment, I unexpectedly came across documents related to cases of rape, bodily harm, theft, and illegal possession of weapons. Some files were intact while others were not. Story 55. I found a dead snake under a carpet once. Another time, I discovered a live snake in a basement and had a large bag of marijuana fall off a shelf and land on me in a big master bedroom closet. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.